Have you ever noticed that God could solve your situation right now, but for some reason He doesn't? Have you ever felt that the promise is right there, so close, and yet the answer still takes time to arrive? This video is for you who are tired of waiting, trying to understand why God keeps you in a season that feels like it isn't moving forward. Today, you're going to discover what is really happening behind the scenes of your waiting and why the answer already exists, yet hasn't reached you. We're going to talk about purpose, spiritual maturity, doors God only opens when you're ready, and the work He does inside you before He does it on the outside. Once you understand this, the way you see your process will completely change. So tell me, have you been praying for something that still hasn't happened? Have you wondered if God heard you? Have you felt forgotten, stuck, or even frustrated by the delay? Stay with me until the end, because this message will bring you clarity, direction, and a peace you may not have felt in a long time. Let's walk together through this answer that God has already released, but is preparing you to receive. Sometimes waiting hurts, not just because it takes time, but because you can't see what God is doing when nothing seems to move. It's that strange feeling of standing still while life around you keeps going. And deep down, even if you don't say it out loud, a question rises. Is He really taking care of me? This is where a truth needs to break through your doubt. Indeed, He who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. Psalm 121:4. God never disconnects from your story. He doesn't get distracted, He doesn't forget, and He doesn't abandon you for even a second. What you call silence is often the sound of God's subtlety. There are movements that make no noise. There are detours that were avoided before you ever realized. There are doors that close to protect you, not to punish you. There are environments being adjusted right now. Conversations, decisions, connections, opportunities, all unfolding beyond your sight, but fully within His hands. God does far more behind the scenes than you imagine. Think of Joseph. He waited in an unjust prison, believing time had stopped. But while he thought nothing was happening, God was moving pieces inside the palace. A dream would trouble the king, a cupbearer would suddenly remember, and a position of leadership would appear at the exact moment. What looked like forgetfulness was construction. What looked like abandonment was alignment. Joseph thought he was stuck, but heaven was working for him, and it may be the same for you now. Maybe God is holding you not because you're late, but because He's positioning things in the atmosphere around you. Maybe what you call stuck is actually God keeping you from stepping through a door that isn't ready or isn't safe. The waiting you feel down here may actually be synchronization happening up there. If you could see what God is moving while you think He is silent, you would rest. Because He's organizing paths you haven't seen, shielding you from situations you never imagined, and building outcomes you would have never thought to ask for. His silence is not absence, it is strategy. And while this happens, a deeper question emerges. What if the lack of visible movement is proof that God is doing something that requires precision? What if the issue isn't the speed of the answer, but its safety? Waiting is not an empty room. It is a spiritual laboratory where God works in the invisible so you don't have to face unnecessary dangers. The time that seems still doesn't reveal divine passivity. It reveals divine perfection. God is building what you are not mature enough to carry yet, preparing environments you wouldn't know how to handle, and protecting you from wounds only He knows would come. Waiting is less about what He withholds and more about what He preserves. And when this awareness begins to unfold inside you, something shifts quietly. Waiting stops feeling like a lost interval and becomes a space where God is refining details you haven't noticed. You begin to realize that what is being prepared around you is also being prepared within you, and that the answer already exists. It's simply being shaped to arrive at the right time, in the right way, in the right heart. Waiting stops being delay. and becomes part of the answer itself. Sometimes the hardest part of waiting isn't the time. It's knowing God could act now but doesn't. It's sensing in your heart that the promise already exists while reality still doesn't show it. It's like something inside you whispers, "It's already released," while everything outside says, "It's not here yet." That tension between what you feel and what you see creates deep doubt, but God reminds you, "For the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens toward the end and will not fail. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay." So Habakkuk 2:3. The promise is alive. It's the timing that is being prepared. There is a difference between God releasing something and you being ready to manifest it. God releases in the spirit before he releases in the natural. He releases in heaven before placing it in your hands. He releases according to purpose before circumstance. And while he does this, he shapes you to sustain what you are asking for. Because anything that arrives without preparation becomes a burden. Anything that comes too early turns into a weight. Anything received without maturity is lost too quickly. Look at Moses. God had already determined Israel's deliverance long before the people ever left Egypt. The answer existed, the promise existed, the direction existed. But before the manifestation, Moses needed to cross an inner desert, confronting fears, insecurities, impulses, and even his own identity. The deliverance was ready, but the deliverer needed to be formed. The promise was decreed, but the man who would carry it was still under construction. Maybe that's what God is doing with you right now. The answer is not the issue. It already exists. It has already been aligned in heaven, written into eternity, decreed even before you prayed. But the manifestation requires that you be strong enough not to lose it, misuse it, or be wounded by it. The promise doesn't change. You are the one being adjusted to it. And this process isn't punishment, it's care. God doesn't prepare you because you're weak. He prepares you because what he wants to give you is big. He molds intentions, heals motivations, adjusts perspectives, aligns expectations. He removes what would limit you and strengthens what will sustain you. Manifestation requires someone capable of carrying it. And God is building that person inside you. Sometimes you feel ready, but God sees what you still don't. He sees reactions, fears, patterns, and internal structures that would collapse under the weight of the promise. He knows that if he gave it now, you wouldn't hold it. If he released it today, you wouldn't enjoy it. If it came too soon, it would become loss instead of blessing. Delay doesn't mean God said no. It means he is saying, "Not yet." Neely. And when you start to understand this dynamic, that something already exists but has not yet become visible, waiting stops being an obstacle and becomes an invitation to grow, to mature, to align with what God is about to reveal. And this understanding opens the door to the next movement. Before God prepares the path, he prepares the heart. There is a moment in the spiritual process when God is not only adjusting the environment around you, he is adjusting you. And often this work is deeper, more intense, and slower than any external change. Because God doesn't hand over ready-made paths to unprepared hearts. He builds strong hearts for the paths that are still ahead. That's why, before he opens any door, he examines you from the inside out. As it is written, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." Psalm 139, 23, 24. The work begins in the soul. And this divine examination isn't meant to expose you or shame you. It's meant to strengthen you. God touches areas you hadn't noticed, points out motives you never saw, and reveals intentions that were hidden even from yourself. Because sometimes the request is right, but the heart is not yet aligned with the purpose. Sometimes you want something from God, but you are not ready for what that something requires. Look at Gideon. He wanted deliverance, but he carried insecurity. He wanted direction, but he was afraid. God didn't start by sending the army or handing over the victory. He started by changing Gideon on the inside. Mighty warrior. His heart had to be remade before the mission. The external battle would be great, but the internal battle was greater. God shaped Gideon before he shaped the situation. And maybe this is your moment now. God is not only preparing the paths, he is preparing you for them. Maybe he is developing courage where there was fear, discernment where there was impulsiveness, humility where there was rush, maturity where there was emotional scarcity. He works internally before he works externally, because what you carry inside is what sustains what he places in your hands. And this process can be uncomfortable. Sometimes it feels like God is touching too much in areas you'd rather leave untouched. But he doesn't touch where there is no purpose. He shines light where you hid shadows. He corrects internal roots so you don't lose yourself when the path opens. Preparation is not a delay of the promise. It is the construction of your ability to live the promise without losing your essence. God's silence in this stage is not distance, it is focus. It's like an artisan working meticulously, shaping details no one sees. He adjusts your motivations, purifies expectations, strengthens convictions. He is forming in you the kind of person who can carry what you asked for without being destroyed by it. Waiting becomes a workshop where you learn to sustain what has not yet arrived. And when you begin to realize that God is doing more inside you than outside, something shifts in your perspective. That anxiety for external movement fades when you understand that the real construction is happening in the deep, silent, spiritual place. And it's from this awareness that you begin to see that even the time that feels stuck carries a purpose you haven't fully recognized. There are seasons in life when everything feels stopped. You pray, try, push, seek, and nothing moves. It's as if heaven were still and the earth were closed, and in those moments, the mind runs to the worst conclusion. Something went wrong. But what if that apparent stagnation isn't a mistake, but an intervention? Scripture confronts this feeling with a truth. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. Psalm 147:3. When everything on the outside seems still, it's often because God is treating something inside you that you haven't noticed. There are wounds that don't bleed, but shape the rhythm of your life. There are memories you think you overcame, but they still influence your decisions. There are fears you never admitted, but they still limit your progress. God sees those hidden layers with a precision you do not have, and that's why he allows seasons of pause that feel like stagnation but are, in truth, silent healing happening deep within the soul. Look at Elijah. After great victories and miracles, he entered a state of deep emotional exhaustion. Nothing in him felt like it was moving. He just wanted to stop, to flee, to disappear. And it was exactly in that moment, in the silence of a cave, far from movement, that God healed his soul. Not quickly, not loudly, but through restoration. The pause Elijah called the end, God was using as healing. This is how God acts when the heart is overloaded with weights you've carried for years. He interrupts movements you would do on autopilot. He closes paths that would lead you to impulsive decisions. He slows you down so that old wounds don't dictate your next season. External stagnation reveals internal treatment. God doesn't waste pauses. He uses each one as a tool of restoration. And in this process, he prepares you not to repeat old patterns, because while life moves fast, wounds hide. But when time seems to stop, they appear, and that's exactly where God places his hands. He touches thoughts, memories, insecurities, expectations, and begins rebuilding you from the inside out. The pause becomes a space where he cleans, heals, and reorganizes the heart so you don't carry old weights into new doors. Sometimes you think you're ready to move on, But God knows your inner world is still bleeding from something you didn't notice. He knows that if He lets you advance now, that wound will seep into the promise. So He holds you back, not to punish you, but to purify you. He treats what you can't see, removes what you never confessed, and heals what you never knew how to name. The pause becomes protection, and the healing becomes part of the preparation. And when healing begins, even slowly, waiting gains new meaning. You realize you are not stuck, you are being restored. And restoration takes time. It takes depth, it takes silence. And when this truth touches you, the anxiety for movement fades, because you finally see that God is not still. He is taking care of you. If this is speaking to you right now, stay with me. There is still so much God wants to reveal to your heart. Few things move the heart as deeply as the silence of God. It's not just the absence of answers. It's the feeling that you're speaking into nothing. It's that prayer that seems to hit the ceiling and come back down. It's that moment when you look for a sign, a direction, a word, and everything stays quiet. But Jesus spoke a sentence we need to remember in times like these. You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand. John 13:7. In other words, God's silence doesn't indicate distance. It indicates depth, because God doesn't speak while He's working in areas you could not understand yet. Sometimes He works at the level of the roots while you only see the soil. Sometimes He is adjusting the entire plan while you only see the delay. And the silence you fear may actually be the environment where God is arranging what you asked for. The absence of noise is not the absence of movement. It is movement that does not depend on your vision. Look at Jesus sleeping in the boat during the storm. The disciples mistook His silence for negligence. They thought He didn't care, that He wasn't paying attention, that He wasn't seeing what was happening. But Jesus was in control the entire time. His silence wasn't indifference, it was authority. The storm didn't disturb Him because He already knew what He would do next. Sometimes God doesn't respond because the storm hasn't yet reached the exact point where His intervention will become clear. And maybe that's what is happening with you. The silence you interpret as abandonment may actually be the time He is holding everything together so He doesn't give you something incomplete. God doesn't speak when the word would confuse you more than help you. He doesn't reveal Himself when your emotions are still too fragile to understand what He wants to show you. His silence is care, not punishment. This silence also exposes what is inside you. It reveals where your faith is anchored. It shows whether your trust depends on the answer or on His presence. It exposes where fear, anxiety, hurry, or control still exist. Silence becomes a mirror where you see not who God is, but who you are in the process. And this revelation is essential for the next step. It's interesting to see how often God uses silence as a language, not to leave you lost, but to position you. He teaches you to listen without noise, to believe without signs, to walk without visible guarantees. In silence, He turns faith into conviction, anxiety into rest, desperation into maturity. That's why so many of God's deepest movements happen when it seems like nothing is happening. And when you start to see this dynamic, silence stops being an enemy. It becomes a place where faith matures, where the heart reorganizes, where the inner vision aligns. You realize God is not distant. He is working with precision, working at the right moment, in the right way, at the right depth. And from this understanding emerges an even more serious truth. God never gives a promise that still has the power to wound you. One of the hardest truths to accept is that not every blessing is safe when it arrives too early. Sometimes the issue is not the promise itself, but the impact it would have on a heart that is not yet prepared. Scripture makes this clear. An inheritance gained too early in life will not be blessed in the end. Proverbs 20:21. What arrives outside of its time may bless for a moment, but destroy in the end. God doesn't hold you back to frustrate you. He holds you back to protect you. Many people ask for doors, opportunities, relationships, breakthroughs, answers, without imagining the weight those things would have if they arrived today, because a promise requires structure, it requires strengthened character, balanced emotions, deep roots. What feels light when you desire it may be heavy when you carry it. God knows this weight better than you. He sees angles you can't see. He sees risks you haven't noticed. He knows what that blessing could reveal, expose, or trigger inside you. Look at David. God chose him as king while he was still young. The promise was already released, but if it had been delivered at that moment, it would have destroyed everything: his calling, his character, his story. David had to walk through deserts, persecutions, injustices, and long years of anonymity before touching the crown. Not because God wanted to make his life harder, but because David needed to be shaped to sustain what he had asked for and what God had promised. This is how God works with you too. He holds the promise until it stops being a threat, until it matures, until you are strengthened. He knows what would happen if he placed it in your hands right now. He knows how your emotions would react. He knows which conflicts would be stirred. He knows what you would lose if the blessing came too early. That's why he waits, not to deprive you, but to preserve you. God doesn't work with impulsive deliveries. He works with safe ones. He doesn't open doors that will fragment you. He doesn't give answers that will destroy your peace. He doesn't place you in positions you cannot sustain spiritually. His delay is protection. His delay is love. His delay is deep care for parts of you that you don't even know need guarding. And when you finally understand that God holds things back, not to frustrate you, but to prevent something good from becoming dangerous, your perspective changes. Waiting stops feeling like punishment and becomes protection, an invisible shield, a boundary placed by God himself to preserve you from something that looks like a blessing, but if it arrived today, would still have the power to wound you. And it's exactly at this point that the journey of waiting reveals something even deeper. What God withholds often reveals more about you than about him. There comes a point in the journey when waiting stops being about what God is doing and becomes about what it is revealing inside you. It's not comfortable to realize this, but it's necessary. Waiting is like a spiritual mirror. It brings to the surface thoughts, emotions, intentions, and fears that you couldn't see while everything around you was moving. God knows this process so well that he says, "I, the Lord, search the heart and examine the motives." Jeremiah 17:10. He doesn't need the waiting to know you, but you need the waiting to know yourself. When everything flows quickly, you lean on the rhythm. When everything stops, you see yourself. And that's when deep questions appear. How much does your faith depend on the answer? How much does your trust depend on timing? How much does your peace depend on control? Waiting exposes what was quiet. It brings to the surface fragilities, insecurities, emotional patterns, and attachments you didn't even know you carried. The apparent delay reveals how you handle the absence of signs. Look at the people of Israel in the desert. While there was movement, they followed. But when God was silent, they complained. When the cloud stopped, they panicked. Waiting exposed in them not just impatience, it exposed unbelief, ingratitude, fear, and a lack of spiritual maturity. The promise existed, but their hearts were not yet able to sustain it. Waiting did not reveal God's weakness. It revealed theirs, and many times, that's what happens with you. Waiting reveals where you still try to control. It reveals where hurry rules. It reveals where fears speak louder than faith. It reveals where your trust is still tied to an outcome rather than to God's character. Waiting doesn't create weaknesses. It simply illuminates the ones that were already there. This season also exposes wrong expectations. Sometimes you're not waiting for the promise. You're waiting for God to do things exactly the way you imagined. Sometimes you don't want the purpose. You want the comfortable version of it. Waiting exposes this misalignment. It shows where you are attached to an idea, a timing, a scenario. And God uses this to mature your heart so the promise is received with understanding, not illusion. Waiting also reveals what is holding you emotionally. Sometimes you think you're waiting on God, but God is waiting for you to release something, a fear, a memory, a narrative, a control, a comparison. Waiting reveals what needs to be released so you can advance. Not because God demands it, but because you wouldn't survive spiritually carrying certain weights into the promise. And when you begin to understand that waiting doesn't expose God, it exposes you, something shifts. It's no longer about, why is this taking so long? But what is this delay showing me? Waiting gains purpose. It stops being a season of pain and becomes a room of revelation. And in this inner space of clarity, you begin to realize that God isn't preparing you only for the doors you asked for, but for doors you never imagined touching. There are requests you make, and there are plans God has. And often His plans are so much bigger that your request cannot explain what He is preparing. That's why waiting rarely fits human logic. God doesn't prepare you only for what you asked for. He prepares you for what He dreamed. As it is written, He is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine. Ephesians 3:20. Your request is the starting point. His purpose is the destination. There are doors you think are big until God shows you the size of the ones He intends to give you. And to touch bigger doors, you must become a bigger version of yourself. Just as Joseph wasn't being prepared merely to leave prison, but to govern a nation. Just as Esther wasn't being prepared just to be queen, but to save an entire people. Just as Moses wasn't being trained to flee Egypt, but to open a sea. Their processes did not match their requests. They matched their purposes. And maybe that's exactly what is happening with you. You asked for something simple, and God began a deep process. You asked for an answer, and God began a transformation. You asked for a door, and God began building an entire hallway. Because when God expands your vision, He expands your capacity to sustain what He will give you. And that kind of preparation takes time. It takes maturity. It takes waiting. When God prepares you for something greater, He works in details you would never touch on your own. He strengthens internal areas that will be demanded later. He enlarges your heart, expands your faith, deepens your humility, matures your spiritual posture. He takes you out of the version that could only handle what you asked for, and shapes the version that can handle what He planned. Waiting becomes a process of invisible expansion, and it's so deep that many times you don't even realize you're being prepared for something far beyond what you imagined. You think God is delaying because He wants to give you what you asked for, but He is delaying because He wants to give you what you never thought to ask for. Delay is not disinterest. It is greatness. Apparent slowness is not lack of power. It is abundance of purpose. The truth is, God doesn't shape you according to the door you asked for. He shapes you according to the door He designed. And this changes everything, because what you asked for might be enough for now, but God is working on the you of years from now, the impact you will still make, the people you will still reach, the situations you will still face. Waiting positions you not just for the next step, but for the entire destiny. And as this perspective begins to grow inside you, waiting stops being a delay and becomes a sign that God is taking you somewhere beyond what you sought. You realize the process doesn't match the request because it matches the greatness of the purpose. And this opens space for a question that prepares the next step of this journey. If this is making sense to you right now, share a word in the comments that describes what God is doing in your heart. There comes a moment when what once seemed distant begins to draw near quietly, not with noise, not with rush, but with the precision of God's timing. And when that moment arrives, you notice something you may not have been able to understand before. The waiting was never delaying the promise. It was preparing you for it. Scripture describes this clearly when it says, "He has made everything beautiful in its time." Ecclesiastes 3:11. God's timing is not only perfect, it is beautiful, complete, and safe. It's interesting to see how the answer often comes in a way completely different from what you imagined. Not because God changed his plans, but because you changed in the process. What you asked for at the beginning of your waiting is not what you need now. Your heart matured, your vision expanded. Your motives were purified, your roots grew deeper. When the waiting ends, you don't just receive what you asked for, you receive what you were prepared to carry. Look at Hannah, the mother of Samuel. She waited years for a child, years that from a human perspective seemed cruel. But when the answer came, she was no longer the same woman. The child would not belong only to her, he would belong to Israel. He would become a prophet, a leader, a judge, a voice of heaven on earth. The promise could never have come earlier because the promise was never small. The answer arrived exactly when her heart was ready to give to God what before would have been only a personal victory. That is how God works when the now doesn't match the purpose. He holds the answer until it not only arrives, but fits, until it not only happens, but makes sense. He waits until the open door won't knock you down, but establish you, until the blessing won't be lost, but will flourish, until you don't walk through it needy, but aware. The end of waiting is not just a page turning, it is the confirmation that God was working all along. And when the answer finally arrives, you begin to notice details you couldn't see before. People who needed to be there, encounters that had to happen, doors that needed to close, internal changes that needed to be completed. The waiting could never have ended earlier because the work wasn't finished, neither outside nor inside. And maybe when you look back, you'll realize that if God had given you everything when you asked, a lot inside you would have broken. Many things would have been misunderstood. Many blessings would have been handled immaturely. Waiting ends when the promise is no longer a risk, but a confirmation. When it doesn't pull you away from God, but draws you closer. When it doesn't feed your anxiety, but strengthens your faith. And in that moment, a quiet truth begins to form. Waiting was not loss, not delay, not punishment. It was part of the construction of the answer itself. It was the foundation that sustained what God was preparing. It was the process that shaped you to live what is coming. And it is exactly this understanding that leads into the next part of the journey, the one that shows that waiting was never an obstacle. It was always a work of God. There comes a moment when you finally realize that waiting was not a hole in the road, but part of the construction of the road itself. What once looked like delay begins to reveal itself as structure. What you thought was holding you back was actually making you stronger. That's why God declares, "But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not grow weary. They shall walk and not faint." Isaiah 40:31. Waiting doesn't only prepare you, it renews you. Because waiting is the place where God works in dimensions that speed could never reach. It's where He deepens roots, aligns motives, awakens convictions, and strengthens areas you would only discover you needed once the promise arrived. Waiting builds spiritual muscle. It forms resilience. It refines the heart in ways immediate answers never could. Waiting is internal work happening at a divine pace. Look at Noah. He didn't just wait for the flood, he waited for the promise of restoration. The ark wasn't built in days, it was built over years. And every hammer strike wasn't just wood being shaped, it was Noah being shaped. The waiting wasn't a delay of God's plan, but the process that shaped a man capable of carrying a new beginning. Noah's world was being prepared at the same time his heart was being formed. And so it is with you. While you wait, God builds inside you the maturity required for what's coming. He strengthens areas you didn't know needed strength. He pulls you out of emotional fragility that would turn the promise into a burden. He prepares you to live not only the answer, but the responsibility that comes with it. Because every promise carries impact, and impact requires structure. Waiting also removes things that cannot go with you into the next season. It removes hurry, pride, impulsiveness, emotional dependencies, unrealistic expectations. It clears the ground of the soul. It reorganizes you internally. It makes room for God to plant something that wouldn't fit inside the old heart. Waiting positions you in the version of yourself that can live the promise without losing yourself in it. And when you understand this, waiting stops being an enemy. It becomes an ally, a spiritual tool, a divine intervention. It builds you in silence so that when the answer comes, you don't just receive, you remain. Because God is not building only the moment of the promise. He is building you for the entire journey that comes after it. And when you perceive this depth, you begin to see waiting through different eyes, not as delay, not as punishment, not as neglect, but as work. A work happening at the right time, in the right rhythm, with the right intensity. A work that reveals God was never still. He was working deeper than you realized. And from this understanding, the heart naturally opens to the final step of the journey, the one that turns all of this into rest, surrender, and renewed hope. Now that you've walked through every part of this journey, you may be able to see your own waiting with new eyes. Not as punishment, not as a sign that God forgot you, but as a work He was building in silence. The question that followed you from the beginning, why does God make me wait, even when He already has the answer, begins to be illuminated by a simple and profound truth. He waited, not because the promise wasn't ready, but because you were still being prepared to receive it without being wounded by it. Throughout this process, God was never distant, not for a single moment. He adjusted the environment, healed wounds you didn't realize were there, strengthened the inner areas that would sustain what was coming, and opened space inside you for a more mature, more whole, more aligned version of yourself. Waiting didn't delay what God had. It ensured that you would be able to live the promise once it arrived. And that changes everything. Maybe now you see that the most important question is not, when will the answer come? But how is God shaping me while it hasn't arrived yet? Because when the heart changes, time stops being an enemy and becomes part of the revelation. Waiting didn't break you, it formed you. Delay didn't weaken your faith, it deepened your roots. Silence didn't drown out God's voice, it refined your ability to hear His whisper. And as this message comes to an end, imagine this scene. Christ gently places His hand on your head, not to hurry anything, not to push you into what comes next, but to quiet what still weighs inside you. It's as if He were saying, I know what I promised, I know what you're feeling, and I know the perfect timing. Walk with me. This image is not fantasy. It is the way He sustains you until the answer arrives. So let two questions echo within you. What is this waiting revealing about what God is building in me? And what do I need to lay down today so I can receive with greater lightness what He has already prepared? If this message touched your heart, consider subscribing and continuing this walk with us. There is still so much God wants to reveal, and I want to walk alongside you through it. And before you go, take a simple, silent, and profound step. Write on a piece of paper, or simply in your heart, the word that best describes what God is shaping inside you during this waiting. Then offer that word to Christ, like someone returning a weight to the only one who knows how to transform it.